screen. Okay, there.
You
There
have
we go.
recorder ready, right?
Thank you very much. So you have heard a lot of great introduction for a lot of the same sort of topics that I'm going to be talking about here. I'm going to be addressing settlement, retention, and yield of larval settlers on some of these different substrate designs that you've heard quite a bit about so far. So that'll provide a good introduction. But obviously, a lot of our goal and a lot of things you've heard about this week, and I know that a lot of us are concerned about on a daily basis, is how do we get up here sort of to a kilometer scale, given the scale of degraded reefs that are in need of restoration. And I think you've heard from a couple other speakers as well, this outplanting and attachment step is one of the rate limiting steps for a lot of coral propagation, both for propagation pipelines, both for fragment and for larval substrates. So the concept of designing substrates that don't need to be actively attached, that have a self-stabilizing sort of overall shape and size, as well as providing advantageous microhabitats, could be, and this is a strategy that, as you know, SECORE has invested quite a bit in developing this type of strategy to obviate that rate limiting attachment step. But just to emphasize, the points that I'm going to be talking about today related to retention and larval sort of habitat success are only a couple of the design considerations that would be involved in terms of when we're talking about upscaling to hundreds of thousands of these things. There's a lot of other design considerations as well, but these are obviously two of the most important ones that I'll be describing today. The pilot work that this is based on was performed by Valerie Chamberlain in Curacao earlier on. You've heard about these little concrete tetrapods a few times already this morning, but Valerie was able to show that just, again, wedging these, just hand placing them within the reef with some understanding that the topography of the reef has a big impact, but provided up to 90% retention and almost 70% yield over a year for this pilot work in Curacao. And with yield, I'm describing that as the proportion of the originally outplanted units that retain a coral. So that means that both are found and have a live coral on them. And so that's how we're defining yield. So that incorporates both retention and survivorship in that yield parameter. So based on that pilot work, in 2018, we had kind of a big brainstorming year and sort of tried to put together what we understood both about the sort of retention, like the self-stabilizing characteristics and the microhabitat characteristics that might be beneficial. And we came up with this suite of substrate prototypes which were produced in 2018 using 3D printed ceramic. And so these are the suite that I'm going to talk to you about today. You've heard some other results from a few of the subsets of these types in some of the other talks, so I'll refer to those as well. So the first stage for settlement, in the corner there, it's a little small to see, I guess, but you see those different types of units, and the letter designations are going to be consistent throughout. So the original concrete tetrapod is the H unit, and the others are A through E, I guess it is, or F. But so again, across several different locations and as many species as we could access, we performed both some choice assays and no choice assays amongst these in terms of settlement, yielding this type of data, but I've kind of summarized all of these assays that we ran in different places, just noting sort of the most preferred and the least preferred unit type. The main result that we got out of this, the B unit tended to be dispreferred everywhere and by everyone. And this is in the upper corner, it's the same shape as the A unit. It's that sort of skinny tetrapod with bumps on it, but the B unit did not have a ceramic slip coat on it. So the texture actually was rougher and sharper, which we expected to be advantageous for settlement. In fact, it wasn't. The larvae really didn't like it. So this was an opportunity we had to eliminate that type of unit. Otherwise, in terms of what was preferred, there's a lot of individual variation. There aren't any really strong, consistent patterns about which one was preferred. However, I'll point out the colored rows there represent sort of a replicated set of settlement preference that was conducted in Mexico during 2 different years. And there is some consistency in terms of within those species groups. So the Orbicellas really preferred the A and C units. Again, same overall shape. The Palmata, on the other hand, preferred those concrete tetrapods, and I think that was consistent with the data that Maria showed you earlier. So some species differences, but no predominant results where we're going to say this really is the best working of the suite that we were looking at. So then we outplanted these, again, a range of locations and species, but generally we had a cattle tag on the bottom which marked a sort of a plot, and then we just, again, wedged the different units and treatments around that plot number to keep track of the individuals. We had different intervals of survey, but I'm going to show you data from sort of somewhere in the 10 to 12 month range, and then so individual years. And as I mentioned before, retention, I'm going to show you two parameters. Retention is just the proportion that we relocated in that plot at that time point, and the yield is the proportion of the total units that we outplanted that we could recover corals from at that time period. So here's some data on retention. And again, the letters are the same. I'm also going to show you the colors are going to be the same in these graphs that I'm showing you. Again, the H unit, the original concrete tetrapod, is here in green. Again, a lot of variation, both between sites, between occasions where they were outplanted. Not really super consistent results in terms of which of these units is retained best. There is a little bit, you can note the like the yellow and gray ones often are at the top. Those are the two in the picture at the bottom. We call them sort of binder stars or death stars. They're chunkier units and they do have a higher mass. And so that's likely where we do see higher retention in those cases is due to mass. But you can also see, so overall over 1 to 3 years, retention is varying between 80% and a lot less than that, below 40%. So again, this starts to hint at there are certain contexts where wedging unattached substrates are going to perform really well, and there are other contexts where they perform quite poorly. That's not surprising, but as we develop some of these data, it begins to allow us to sort of hone in on where the cost of attachment is going to be worthwhile. So similarly, here are the yield numbers for those same outplants that I showed you retention for. Again, I will say in a lot of cases, the rates of yield and survivorship are very disappointing, not acceptable, not what we want. But this is the sort of variation that we've seen at the sites where SECORE has done this in Curacao and Mexico. So over a couple of 1 to 2 years or 2 to 3 years, yield rates that we have observed run between 20 to 30% and 0%. Yes, we get a lot of 0% yields over that time frame. If you were here and with some of the other talks in this session, I will just point out in other locations where our partners are working, in the Dominican Republic, Maria showed you a moment ago, they had some palmata at the more like 40 to 50% yield at a year. And Alex was just telling us about, even higher. So, there are higher rates of yield that do occur, but they are certainly not reliable and regularly seen in many sites in the Caribbean. Okay, now what I'm showing you, so in the top panel, this is the same data as is over in the end time point in the original graph there on the right. So it's just showing you the yield for each substrate type for 3 different species. So that's the data that I showed you already. On the bottom panel, this shows you the yield on the retained unit. So in other words, if we discount the retention rates and we just look at the units that are still there, it's interesting to note, so for certain, so like for the F unit there, if we retained all this, if we didn't have a loss of the loose substrates, the yield goes up by like doubles or more than doubles, right? For other units, it doesn't change that much. So again, this data helps us begin to hone in. It's likely, I would expect, that if the cost of attaching those substrates doubles our yield, that's probably an investment that we want to make. In other cases, it doesn't show up as having that much effect. So again, this helps us begin to hone in on where the investment for attaching units is going to be worthwhile. The last sort of location and sort of case study, our collaborators at Ames had also done some similar tests with some of these same substrate types. They were outplanted at Back Numbers Reef at 3 different sites. You can see down in the lower corner there. And the results that they obtained there were similar in a lot of ways in that on the right panel there, you can see the different substrate types that we've been describing with those letters. No difference in the yield among those substrate types, but there was a substantial difference between sites in terms of the yield that was obtained at those sites. In other words, like double. So the difference in yield was between 30% and something more like 10 to 12%. Again, they did a lot of work in terms of characterizing the benthic community in these different sites to try to attribute that difference. It's not easy to attribute that difference. There are really marginal differences in benthic community between those sites. So there's just a lot that we still don't understand about what's driving that survivorship. But again, not a real strong basis for saying, hey, this is a substrate that works a whole lot better than the others. So in my conclusions, we don't have consistent or substantive differences among these different substrate designs. Therefore, we have been moving forward with some of those other design considerations that I showed you on that big chart in the beginning. So cost and ease of manufacturing, getting things where we need them. We see tremendous variability in yield, in retention as well as yield. Certainly yield rates of 30 to 50% we observe in certain cases. They're fairly rare cases in the Caribbean, but there is, and we also see that there is a variable influence of retention on that. So this provides an opportunity where we can hone in on investing that effort and attachment where it's going to gain us the most in terms of yield. I will reiterate, the rates of yield and survivorship of early outplanted settlers is extremely disappointing in most cases. This is still our biggest bottleneck. I'm not aware of, a lot of us have been thinking on this for quite a few years. I'm not aware of any breakthroughs yet. I think there's another session today. I'm hoping to get some more good ideas, but this is still our biggest challenge. I would just like to emphasize this means that local management and controlling climate change are the most important steps to our restoration endeavor, because unless we can maintain a viable environment where we're putting these corals into, it's not going to matter. In certain cases, predation is also a huge issue with these outplants, even ones that are grown up even a little bit. If there is additional investment in post-settlement husbandry, predation can still be a huge issue in certain places. Some places it's not a big deal, but you heard from David Mead on the first time. So for example, on the GBR, predation is a huge issue. And they've really invested a lot in designing these substrates that have sort of predation, more concern with predation protection sort of built into that substrate so the settlers are protected. So that's another opportunity through these design substrates that can be addressed. Okay, quick teaser. So we are currently, especially with our Mexico team, taking now a view to say, okay, how much does attachment really cost and how much does it gain us? And so in a future refutures, hopefully we'll be able to report where we're really taking different substrate designs and different attachment methods with the stopwatch and really calculating how long it takes and what the yield improvements are. So those will be some results that we'll hopefully be presenting at a future refutures. And I must acknowledge our many, many partners and funders and helpful organizations that we love working with. This particular work was particularly funded by the Nature Conservancy and the California Academy of Sciences. Thank you very much. And thanks, all of our speakers did pretty well. So I'll take a couple questions and I'll be around for discussion. Thank you all for finding us in this remote session room. And thanks to our speakers. Yes, questions?
That was awesome. How much do you think the results would vary based on rugosity, complexity, or reef type? Do you think that a certain substrate type would work better in different environments?
Yeah, so the question has to do with the substrate rugosity sort of and the configuration of the reef and how that affects the success of different substrate designs. It absolutely has an impact. And again, Liza spoke about sort of a not totally different, but an alternate approach where, if your reef has really sort of fine scale rugosity, little tiny beads are probably going to work better than a larger unit that sort of, wedges halfway or something like that. So there absolutely is. And there's definitely opportunity to better match sort of reef profiles, I think, with particular unit designs. We as SECORE have not had the gumption or the capacity to really address this sort of fine scale reef characterization. I think that that's definitely an important step. And you heard David Mead talk about this some in terms of doing more large scale and developing AI systems where it's like, okay, you're driving over a reef with a camera out the back and you have some algorithms that say, okay, this is an appropriate reef area for this outplant, so I'm going to start dumping substrates off the back of the boat, and then when I hit a reef area that isn't, then it stops. So I think there's definitely potential for getting there. Ames is a lot closer than we are, certainly, but I think there's definitely opportunity to hone that. It's not something we've been able to really tackle. Any other questions? As I said, I'll be around, so I'm happy to chat with folks. But I'd like to thank all of our speakers for this session. Really great work and great timing. So we'll conclude there. Thank you very much. Thank you. That was really helpful. Alex, thank you. Really, really cool.
This start F shape.
Yes.